I'm not going to lie, interviewing a journalist is never not an intimidating thing to do. But Eleanor Dallaway is also a pretty cool human being. Apart from having a really extensive background in cybersecurity journalism, she's also a human being, funnily enough, and is now on a journey to explore her own startup and doing some not-for-profit work and such too with Take the Mic. But yeah, let's have a listen to her journey. Eleanor, it is really lovely to get to finally get to talk to you, and I have so many questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get through them all today. But let's start with your career in cybersecurity journalism. It's a very specific, very complex choice, I would say. What drew you specifically to that field and keeps you in it?
Oh, nothing drew me to it, actually. I'm the age-old cliche that I fell into it by accident. Went to university, studied English, language, literature, became quite passionate about writing, knew I wanted to go into journalism. So I was just seeking any job in journalism, really, after I graduated. And the first one that came up was as assistant editor or assistant to the editor of Cybersecurity magazine, which at the time was based in Oxford, and which is where I was living. So it's sort of, I remember thinking, well, I'll do that for about a year. I'll get it on my CV, and then I'll move into a more glamorous field.
How did that work out for you?
Fashion or something like that. And that was genuinely my intention. But the industry, it hooked me in. And I actually, within, I think it was about 14, 15 months of landing there, I became editor. The editor left, and my publisher at the time had this, what I believed was misplaced faith in me to take the editor's chair. And I felt too young, I felt too inexperienced, but I did it. And it never looked back, really. And then I think it's been 18 years now that I've and that I have dipped into other industries throughout my time as well. So I became editor or director of multiple magazines in various sectors, including retail and the wine and spirits industry as well, which was Brilliant. A lot of fun. Yeah. The on-trade, I felt like maybe this is more my calling. But I've stayed with cybersecurity the whole time, really. So and now obviously exclusively in the cyberspace.
And obviously in 18 years that would have changed a lot. And you mentioned in the beginning about the lack of faith as such, or that your editor had faith in you. Have you found it? Like we know that that's something that women in particular tend to struggle with, that, I don't know, imposter syndrome you may call it, but I think we just naturally assume that it was a mistake or that we should have had second these things. Do you think your attitude towards that has changed? It may have taken 18 years, but has it changed?
Definitely. I think imposter syndrome, I do think, gets too overused now. I think it's become almost fashionable to talk about having imposter syndrome. Although I do definitely believe it's real. I do think it's one of those things that's probably talked about a little bit too much or overused. I definitely think at the beginning, though, when I was 22 and taking that editor's chair, that I had probably genuine and justified imposter syndrome. I definitely was an imposter. But just grew into the role, really. And having people that had the faith in me, and then the support of an industry. And I really did feel backed by the industry, I think. I leaned on editorial board and contacts that I'd met through interviewing them. I think that was probably what got me through it. I wonder when I stopped feeling like an imposter. I definitely did at some point. But I reckon it probably took about, I don't know, 8-9 years, probably.
It does take a while. I can't.
I think so. But in that, it was never sort of black and white. It sort of like went through the shades of grey and would sort of gradually feel more and more confident. And then one day just felt like, oh, actually, I could do this with my eyes closed. I am no longer an imposter. So yeah, it's and I haven't sort of suffered with that since, which is good. I think. Good. yeah, speaking engagements, I still sometimes feel out of my comfort zone, but I would probably describe it as that more than imposter syndrome.
They say growth is where, out of your comfort zone is where you're going to find growth. And I always think that when people are willing to grow, then they're looking for their best selves, the improvements in there. So
yeah,
kudos to you to continue to do the public speaking. And if it does, bring you out of your comfort zone and make you feel uncomfortable. So you founded the Women in Security and Cybersecurity Network. And obviously over that time, there's going to have been changes. I know I've been in tech for 19 years, only cybersecurity for 9. And even in those 9, I've seen changes. But you obviously reporting on it and being much more involved with the weeds of these things, what kind of shifts have you observed around the representation of women in the industry?
There's definitely been a big increase, I think, in the attention that the subject gets, the multiple networking groups and events, awards, everything really. There's been a huge amount of attention. There's also been the decline of things like booth babes. And at the beginning of my tenure, I would go to multiple industry events, and booth babes were a real thing back then. So it's good to see a declining that, although of course we're still seeing embarrassing faux pas from some vendors, like the lampshades in Vegas. But generally speaking, I think an increase in awareness, an increase in calling out of problems, of calling out misogyny, is definitely the way we've gone. Is the rhetoric in the industry still predominantly male? Absolutely. I think the language that we use, the imagery, is often very male-centric. The thing I think is still a problem is that women tend to get pushed into the more non-technical roles. So I think we're really good at being like, we need more women. But when we get women, they're assumed into certain positions. And that sort of really grinds my gears, I think. And I think when they do take those technical roles, the stories I hear, certainly from the people I've interviewed, is that they have to prove themselves way more than a male colleague ever would. Often feel the need to overqualify themselves or just adorn themselves in certificates or qualifications to make them feel worthy of those roles. So I think there's still that's at play. But I always say that I've had a hugely positive experience as women in the industry. Perhaps maybe that's because society is quite comfortable with me as a cybersecurity journalist, as a writer, something that's non-technical. But the interviews I've done over the years tell a different story, and I'm not naive enough to think that everyone has had that same positive experience I have, because I know that's not the case. And I think that's what promotes or inspired me to launch the Women in Cybersecurity Network when I was at InfoSecurity magazine, giving women like a place to meet and share those stories and a platform on which they could talk about their challenges and share their wins as well was really important. So definite improvement. There's definitely been a shift, but it's not perfect. It's still not perfect.
I think those kind of networks like the Women in Cybersecurity Network are key to making the change. And not that they can change it. If you've got all the women in the room together with the intention to change, you still need the men on board in order to change it. But I think getting women together so that they can understand the reality of other women's experiences leads to them talking about it more, or like, I will always find it easier to stand up for somebody else than I will to stand up for myself. I don't know whether that's an Irish thing or a human thing or what the hell it is, but it just seems to be the way that I'm built. So I've always been the only woman in the team right up until about 5 years ago, I think was the first time I ever worked with a woman in the same technical team as me. And exactly
Really?
like what you're saying, I remember when I started working in cyber first, I was working in support, and we had to close, I don't know what it was, 200 cases a month or something. And I used to make it my business to close 300 because I needed to prove that I deserved to be there, because I didn't think that I did deserve to be there. And I did that consistently. I realized I'd done that consistently throughout my whole career. And the only difference between me and them really was I was female and they weren't. But meeting other women and understanding and learning about how they've experienced things and what they've done in certain situations has definitely made me speak about it more. And then I think it stops us from doing those kind of self-destructive things when we understand other women. Other people tell me that there's no need for that, I'm going to listen to them. Me telling me there's no need for that, probably not listen to me. That's very likely a me thing, But I have definitely met other women who react in a similar way, like when they're told, no, you don't need to do that, or that's not okay, or you need to speak to somebody about this, that they, that wouldn't have happened if you didn't have networks like yours, or like I'm in the WESIS side of things, where women can get together and actually talk about their experiences like that. So I think that's the root of my thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the first time ever, the last Grab the Mic event that I ran, so when I left InfoSecurity magazine, I had to leave behind the Women in Cybersecurity network, which was genuinely heartbreaking. And after being at Assured for about a year, I thought, well, what was to stop me creating a new network? So I founded Grab the Mic Women in Cyber, and that's a moving women event that we co-locate at various different industry events. And the last one we ran was at DTX in October. And for the first time ever, we have more men in the audience than women.
Really? Well done.
I know. And I just thought that's really, really cool because they want to be part of that conversation. And, obviously the ally piece is, I think, crucial, especially when it comes to sort of calling out misogyny. And it was just the sort of halfway through, I looked around and realised, oh my God, and sort of did a sort of little quick head count. And I was like, this is amazing. So
fantastic.
I think, the more we can get everyone to be involved in that conversation, I think, not just women, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes with talking about it more, so that there's no fear. Fear breeds where there's no communication. I think whatever it is, if we're not talking about it, people will start overthinking it or making assumptions. But the more we talk about it, the more we can make it.
And I wonder whether I had a man on the panel. So we had a panel of 5, so 4 women and Rick Ferguson, and who's always been very vocal about speaking about gender equality. So I wonder whether maybe the inclusion of a male voice made either A, they were more interested, hopefully not that option, but B, maybe it just sort of gave them that inexplicit permission that, well, if there's a male speaker, then we're welcoming a male audience. And I don't know, maybe that was the shift.
It's the same thing, I guess, in the reverse, when they started to include women on panels as such, to encourage more women to attend the same kind of idea. Rick is really super easy to listen to as well, and like you say, super passionate. That helps too, for sure.
Exactly.
And then on the human side of things, like cybersecurity is often thought of as like super technical and really complex, and only the technical people could possibly understand that. When you were making cybersecurity content, how did you make it so that it was something that was engaging for everybody, regardless of how technical they were?
I know, it's tricky. It's tricky to write about a technical topic non-technically. It's actually a harder skill, I think, than actually writing about it technically. But I'm lucky because I'm not particularly technical. So writing technically is what comes easily to me. To make it engaging, I think the key is storytelling. I've always been a massive fan of storytelling. And I think if you can do that in a way, it sort of really sucks the audience in. I think focusing on people, I always try and find the human angle of any story. And almost without fail, every cyber news story or feature or conversation will have an implication on people. So I always look at the human angle, and I think that's obviously more relatable. So I think that makes for engaging content. And certainly at Assured, launching Assured Intelligence, our own content platform, my objective was always to talk about technical topic in a non-technical way, in a way that it invites in everyone. So our audience is typically senior directors, non-event directors, non-executive directors, and the C-level. And I think actually quite often they're not that technical, so they don't want to be reading multiple acronyms. They want it to be simple. They want to be able to understand it. And I think it's also given them permission to read it and understand it and not feel like they have to run to someone else and fact check it or say, well, what does that mean? So I think sometimes that can be quite embarrassing, right? Yeah. So we've tried to go down this storytelling, human, talk about it without using acronyms.
I love that.
And I like writing like that. So it kind of works for me.
Win-win. Yeah. I think there's been finally like an eye-opening moment with the introduction of Dora, and I know we've been talking about it for years, but because it's coming into play and it's going to affect the board members who wouldn't typically have to understand at the level they now do have to understand if they're making those decisions. And I think whilst it's entertaining those people learning more or understanding more and or finding the means like Assured where they can understand it on a human level, I think it's also starting to make other areas of the industry start thinking about, well, maybe people other than the cybersecurity people or the tech people or the SOC people need to actually understand what this is all about. And that's refreshing because, you know, much like yourself, I would have been customer facing all of my career. Even when I tried not to be, I still ended up customer facing. It was always storytelling that bridged the gap, whether you're talking to technical people, the procurement folk, the C-levels, the end users. There's always a story that can connect everybody and make sense of it all. And it's really kind of, I find it, it's heartwarming, the term. It's a relief to see that it's starting to go in that direction because it was such a huge gap. And I think with the way I wander off a little bit now, but with things like AI in particular, everybody's terrified of AI. It's going to take all their jobs and only the technical people will know about it. And then you go into like quantum computing and all that, you know, where people go, ooh. But that's going in this direction super fast. And, you know, only the people that really understand all of that, like the math brains, as I call them, get all of that stuff. And then on the other side, you've got all the humans that are too terrified to use it and trying to figure out what skills they've got use for, or go, I don't know, grow veggies. Like the computer can't do that yet. But somewhere in the middle, somebody needs to connect the two parts, because it doesn't matter if you're just growing veggies in your garden. Somewhere along the path you're going to cross, whether it's the purchases that you make, whether it's the tools that you use, somewhere you're going to need to understand the cybersecurity potential impact of what it is that you're doing, or how AI might impact it. And if nobody is translating in between and creating those stories and that human connection, then we're just going to have this massive gap of them and us, I think.
Yeah, totally. I think AI is a perfect example for that as well. And I think we quite often get asked, or we write about how to make board level executives care about cyber. And I think humans just are inherently selfish, aren't they? And so if you can make it personally applicable to them, or you can make them think, how would you personally feel, or what would the ramifications be on you if there was a huge incident and then the reputation was damaged and you had financial loss and you weren't able to operate? And as soon as they put themselves like in those shoes or think about, oh God, this is how I'd feel, that typically opens eyes and minds and hopefully purse strings to invest in, you know, the cyber execs and talent and whatever's needed to secure the businesses. So I think making it personal works on all types of levels in terms of cyber.
Absolutely. That's the key. And then when it comes to cybersecurity journalism side of things, I think one of the things that has been a risk and is becoming more and more of a risk now is that there's a lot of misinformation online, whether it's been written by AI or sourced inaccurately by AI, or it's just blatantly untrue. Like, how would you combat that, or how have you been coming up against that so far?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it might sound counterintuitive as a journalist, but I think sometimes it pays to cut out the noise. In the past, I spent hours trawling Twitter, looking for stories, looking for, you know, interesting tidbits, but I totally fell out of love with it. Thanks to self-serving nonsense on there, the pylons, the arguing for the sake of it, the having an opinion on absolutely everything, and eventually definitely misinformation as well. So I think it's tempting as a journalist to jump on a rumoured attack or a breach just because you want to be the one to break it first. But that's never really been my style. I think I'm too risk adverse for that. And that fear of reporting something inaccurately was always just too great. So I think instead, I've always chosen to sort of wait for the story to break and unfold, and then I can sort of pick it apart, provide the analysis, and most importantly, I suppose, the actionable advice and takeaways, which is a type of journalism I've always focused on. I think one of the bigger challenges I faced in my past role was the emergence of mainstream media. suddenly jumping on the bandwagon, joining the party, and sort of starting to cover what was once our own little niche. I mean, we were B2B, and that's what we did. But suddenly, the BBC and the Guardian and Times, and everyone else, with much bigger teams and much bigger budgets, was suddenly sort of encroaching on that space. And I think the key, really, to weather that storm was always to stay in our own lane. We were B2B, but we had the access to the experts. We had those relationships. We had the specialist knowledge and understanding. So I think it's just about staying focused. And it's the same at Assured Intelligence. We're a not-for-profit when it comes to the editorial output. So we've got no obligation to get a certain amount of eyes on the page or to break news first or anything like that. So it's just all about staying in your lane, really, and doing what you do well. And I think that applies to misinformation. I think it's just don't jump on the bandwagon. Don't react too quickly. Just wait, let it unfold, and then do things your way. That's probably the best. But I do believe, and I've said this for about the last 6 months or so, that one of the greatest threats to humanity at the moment is misinformation, and that ability or the lack of ability to be able to tell fact from fiction. I think it's just one of the scariest things that we're facing as a society.
Absolutely. And your integrity at the core of it, I guess, for the sake of breaking something early and getting it wrong, the amount of damage done by that versus all of the years you spent building up, the reputation of integrity, is it worth it in the long run? Like,
it's not a forgiving industry either, is it?
That's for sure.
People are not afraid to call people out and say you're talking rubbish or that's wrong. So I think erring on the side of caution is always sensible.
Smart, When you were the editor for Cybersecurity magazine, was there any pivotal moments or stories that you remember that shaped that publication's direction or influence?
Stories. The big stories that always stick in mind, definitely WannaCry, is, to me, that's one of those moments where you remember exactly where you were when you found out, which is really sad. Like how people talk about when Princess Diana died or 9/11. Yeah. But WannaCry, I remember being a huge thing. Much earlier, the HMRC data breach. But the ones I think that always, again, it's like the more human angles, like the Ashley Madison that resulted in the first suicide that was sort of very easily attributable to a cyber attack. They're the ones I kind of remember and sort of can feel the pain of those when they happened. In terms of sort of what was pivotal, you would never believe it, but when I joined Cybersecurity magazine, there wasn't even a website. It was a print magazine, and I was tasked with like launching a website and webinar series, online summits, all of anything digital was part of the evolution of the magazine that I was sort of responsible for. So I think the most pivotal thing was going digital. That makes me feel really old.
I don't know. I remember building like websites back when I had learned how to do HTML, and everything was built with code. Like there was no selecting items and putting them in back in, what was it called? Some Dreamweaver or something back in the day.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. I remember when that came out and going, oh my God, thank goodness, that's hours and hours and hours of work. I don't have to manually write anymore. So you're not alone. I don't like long for those days, that's for sure. I remember building them from scratch. You mentioned WannaCry there. Where were you then when WannaCry? Because I remember where I was. I'll tell you in a minute. But where were you?
I was actually walking through like a forest with my eldest was like a baby at the time, and so I was on. I think I was still on maternity leave, or I'd recently returned. It was one of my days off, and I was walking through a forest with him in like a baby carrier, and I got a phone call. I think it was a Skenzy PR or something actually. That was like, we've just heard about this event happening, can we get you like commenting on it? And I just remember thinking, oh my God. So yeah, that's where I was. Where were you?
So huge. Like I was working in support in Tenerife at the time, and we rotated somebody in on the EMEA side to do support at the weekends. It was just one person, and it was a Saturday, I think, when it broke. Well, at least when we found out about it. And I was working support, and I remember the first hour or so, you might get one call, two calls maybe during the whole day. And I remember in the first hour, I hadn't had anything. And then all of a sudden, the queue opened up, the chat opened up, the calls opened up, and I was alone. I remember going, what the hell? But it was the first time I had to learn where to find and how to invoke the like incident response as such
Right.
within there, because what we would have done at the time was work to create like plugins to find it and get that pushed out to people immediately. So we did like within that evening, I think. But just, I was relatively new. I was only there about 6 months, I think. And I remember, like, I thrive in that kind of chaos. Like, it's my
Right.
favorite place to be. And I remember being like laser focused at the time, finding everything. And when the day was over, I remember kind of dissolving into my seat, going, "Oh my God, I haven't worked that hard since I worked in bars." Like, but it stuck with me, and I still use it. I used to use it when I was working in sales there as an example of how quickly we could turn solutions around, and how quickly things can just go to hell. Like, and we've had big things since then, but nothing that impacted everybody on quite the level of panic, both internally and externally. And since then, I think people, when you
Yeah.
have big ones like that, people start to go, okay, well, maybe we need to
Yeah.
have a pre-written response we're going to do when these things happen. Whether
Oh,
it's
what a good
customers,
idea.
imagine that. Because nobody ever builds those things until something actually happens. Like, and I'm sure when COVID happened, I'm sure there's a lot of companies that were going, damn, that,
Yeah.
business continuity plan we were supposed to have, we probably should have
Yeah.
done that. But that's how it
Absolutely.
goes.
CrowdStrike was pretty big this year, though.
True, actually, yeah.
That
I
was
remember where I was for that too. Do you?
yes, yeah. It was actually a few days before my birthday, and I just landed in Spain, and my partner was taking me away, and I remember thinking, oh, thank God we got here, because all the airports sort of went down, didn't they?
Yeah.
But we just landed in Spain, yeah. But that was a really big one.
That was huge, actually. I think that was the one that made people really understand the impact or the potential impact of an attack, even though it wasn't an attack. But I was in B-sides in Basingstoke, which is one of the 1,000
Okay.
B-sides. And I remember wondering whether some people would be missing from the event. Was there going to be a lot missing that were
Yeah.
working on it? I think there was a couple of speakers that didn't make it that day. But it was some of the most fascinating conversations I've ever had, because everybody wanted to talk about it and how that would have impacted them and what they would do to respond and what they thought it might be. And I too thought, oh, am I going to get home?
Yeah.
So I rang my brother in London, and I was like, I might have to stay with you tonight if I can't get A, the train, and B, the plane. But the pilot I was flying home with Aer Lingus, and I remember laughing to myself because the pilot announced to everybody, we haven't been impacted by the CrowdStrike issue because our systems aren't as up to date as everybody else's. I was just sitting there going, don't tell people that. I know today it's a good thing, but don't tell people that. And he was so delighted with himself because they were the only flights that were going that day, I think. So
I like the way he was wearing it like a badge of honor.
I suppose at that point, it was like 8 o'clock in the evening. I suppose at that end of the day, most people just didn't care as long as they were going home. But I was kind of looking around and going, did anybody else hear what he just said? Like, no way. No, I just told everybody.
It was a brilliant demonstration of the whole misinformation, wasn't it? Because people jumped to conclusions immediately, and it was touted as like a nation state attack and then ransomware. There was so many different rumors that went round before eventually, obviously, the truth came out. But yeah, again, a classic case of if you'd have jumped on that too quick as a journalist and reported it as a nation state attack, you'd definitely look very silly.
And there was plenty of businesses that jumped on the blame game, like we would never do this. And that's something I personally have a hate for, because I'm a big believer in karma. You don't do stuff like that, it'll come for you. And I just think it's bad form to do it, because everybody has to assume that at some point it's going to happen to them. The minute you start thinking it's never going to happen to you, then you're already in trouble. But it wasn't as bad. I've seen it worse in previous instances. But there's always going to be some people who think that they're untouchable talking about that, and unfollow all of those ones.
Absolutely.
But you've had the fun of advising the UK government as well on cybersecurity strategy. What were I know I've worked a little bit with some of different governments, different countries, and it's always been fascinating to me. What are the most surprising insights that you've gained, or are you, if you're allowed to share?
Yeah, for my sins. It was actually really early on in my career. This is probably the ultimate imposter syndrome moment, actually. So I hadn't been editor for very long. So I was in my early to mid 20s, and got the call up from one of the MPs at the time, William Wallace, I think his name was, or someone in his team anyway, and just sort of said, would you be able to come in and do some advisory work with us and sort of I remember thinking, well, no, absolutely not. I just told my mum last night that I couldn't fix her laptop, so I definitely can't do this. So I think this is when I learned the art of delegating, and also understanding where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. So what I did was I created a task force. So I went to 6 professionals in the industry that are very well known, either CEOs of the major industry associations, someone from academia, someone from private sector, a practitioner, a CISO, and I compiled them together, and I just led them, basically got them into the same room. We did some brainstorming, we did some preparation, went into the House of Commons, which is really exciting, and then we did some presentations to them. They told us what their challenges were, and then we went away, adapted the work, and that was it, really. So I certainly wouldn't ever say that I advised the government, but what I did was compile the task force that advised the government.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of being able to recognise that, well, I can't do that, but I am in the position where I can bring together the people that can. I can facilitate them. I can moderate those sessions, and then I can put them in front of the government. So yeah, it was very bizarre.
So pretty cool, though. I think, well, what I've seen with any of the government bodies, I guess, that not that I've worked with, but we've worked with them, whether they're customers or on a consult kind of a basis, is that they're never where I expect them to be, which is funny. As a human being, where I expect them to be, not necessarily as a tech. And it's funny because I also understand how much red tape, like they have more red tape than any other industry to get through. So of course that's going to slow things down. And I guess the biggest challenge I've seen many of them having is just that, like they want to and need to get ahead of the curve, but then by being a government body, they've got so many hoops to jump through, so much red tape to cross, that it keeps them behind the curves in many cases. And I've been surprised sometimes by what's not there, and surprised sometimes by how innovative and genius they can be within those not within those loopholes, but in that red tape, which teaches me a lot, for life anyway. But definitely it was not what I expected it to be when I went in and started talking to them and working with them, that's for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of legacy tech and a lot of sort of limited budgets, of course. But like you said, I think there is a big gap between the willingness and the innovation and actually the intelligence of the people versus what can actually be done because of the red tape. But I guess it's even a positive thing to think that they were proactively reaching out to industry. Like, so often I think there's a massive gap between public sector and private sector and industry itself. So I think it's good that they were aware of the shortfalls and their limited knowledge gaps and able to reach out to the right people. Well, I was obviously not the right person, but I was able to get them the right people.
Because you got them what they needed. At the end of the day, you put the right resources in front of them. And you're right, actually, I hadn't even thought of it like that. Like, a willingness to reach out is half the battle. Like, because if they're going to be very insular in their approach and they're absolutely going to miss something, it makes sense to reach out to those who are at the forefront of what's happening.
Right.
I'd say that would have been a really interesting conversation. I wish I'd have been a fly on the wall for that.
I remember my mum saying, "You're doing what? You couldn't even fix my laptop last week."
It's funny where you'll find yourself, I think, especially in cybersecurity. Like, you could very quickly go from being very much behind the scenes coding and writing stuff to finding yourself suddenly talking to people that you would have been intimidated by 5 minutes ago. And that's part of the joy, is it levels us all, because we're all well capable of clicking on that dodgy link or, giving the wrong information to the wrong people. As much as we like to think we're perfect, even those of us that work in the industry, and that we won't do it. It's all really about perfect timing and catching people, when they're stressed or busy, and, it can still happen. So then, moving to assured intelligence after all that time working for InfoSecurity magazine, how does it differ from the work that you were doing before? I know you've mentioned not for profit, and what are you hoping to get or hoping to achieve with it?
I mean, it's weird because in some ways I'm doing very similar things, but in another way it's a completely different world. So I think the first thing was the culture shock, going from a FTSE company, RELX Group, to, I don't think people realise as well that InfoSecurity magazine is part of RELX, which is just a massive.
I hadn't until you just said it, yeah.
Yeah, number 14 in the FTSE, so 40,000 employees worldwide, just an enormous company. So going from that into a startup where I was co-founder, number 3, there was 3 of us co-founders. And, you know, for the first 3-4 months of my time at Assured, it was just the 3 of us in this tiny little room, feeling like, you know, on the preface of something. It was really lovely, actually. And when you reflect back on it, it was a really great time. We have obviously spun up quite quickly since, so it definitely sort of entered the scale up rather than startup now. And numbers are really growing. But so the cultural shock was the first thing. And I found that while I'd been a little bit nervous about giving up what I felt like was a very stable career, I'd been there for 16 years, I think, at Reed. So I felt very comfortable there, and it felt like a huge risk to then go and launch something of my own. So once I got over that, sort of started to feel a bit more settled. So there's 2 parts of the business. Assured is the cyber insurance, the UK's first and only cyber insurance brokerage that only brokers cyber. And then my part of the business is the Assured Intelligence, which is where we do the content side. So that is like a little mini InfoSec, I suppose.
Yeah.
That belongs in a cyber insurance company. But the main difference is editorial autonomy. So that part of the business is not for profit. We don't have sponsors. We don't want sponsors. So everything we write is done because we think it matters, and we think it's going to help our clients and our customers and the industry generally. So it's being able to just take the break off in terms of, we don't do news. There's enough. It's about staying in your lane, right? There's enough people doing that. I don't want to go and try and compete. So we do features, we do podcasts, we do interviews, all of which happens to be one of my favourite things. Which is obviously by design, and just writing for that slightly different audience, that more senior, perhaps definitely less technical, but perhaps less educated about cybersecurity as an industry, but certainly those that want to upskill in the space, which ties over really nicely with the Assured clientele. So yeah, I didn't ever envision that I would land in the cyber insurance space. I definitely didn't think I'd ever be a co-founder. Or an entrepreneur. It just sort of happened. So huge changes. But then other times I'm at Black Hat or RSA and I'm interviewing someone, or I'm writing up a feature, and it feels like I'm doing the same thing that I've always been doing. So it's nice because there's a comfort in a lot of the work I do, but there's also the advantage of being out of the corporate world and in the lovely scale-up space where we have the potential to like reshape and evolve an entire industry, which is genuinely what I believe we are doing at Assured. So it's just making real meaningful change, but also clinging on to the editorial part of my job, which is lovely too.
I love it. So still in the outside of the comfort zone and doing plenty of growing there. Looks it.
Absolutely. And it's, it's mucking in as well. I think especially right at the beginning, you find yourself doing a bit of everything because we started with a really small team. Startup life, yeah. And I actually really enjoyed that, like just being right in the weeds. And it's been such an experience. It's definitely jumping outside of my comfort zone. But I feel totally at home, and I feel like I've landed exactly where I was meant to be. So that's good.
Well, that's lovely. I like that. You mentioned how you got started with Grab the Mic as well. What are the goals you have for that?
So Grab the Mic which is probably quite confusing actually, it's in 2 sections. So we've got Grab the Mic Cyber Stories, which is the podcast. And then we've got the Grab the Mic Women in Cyber series, which are the live events. The podcast is a bit like you were saying, actually, a passion project, really. It's a monthly podcast where I pick someone from the industry to really dive into their backgrounds and tell their story. It's about eclectic voices. We wanted to pay homage, I think, to the fact that there is a bit of an echo chamber in cybersecurity. You typically do hear very similar people talking about very similar things, being given the mic over and over again. And actually, it's about inviting those different voices onto the podcast, giving various people different pinpoints in the industry, like a platform. And again, like that storytelling, that human element. So that's the podcast. And then the Grab the Mic events. Yeah, we roadshow them. So International Cyber Expo, DTX, we've got a couple lined up for next year. And we just take over, do like a stage takeover at those events, do sort of networking drinks after the session and things. And it's just, I suppose it's a way of keeping alive that Women in Cyber network in a different way.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's giving back. Again, it's not for profit. I'm not making any money out of it. I don't want to make any money out of it. But it's just a way of being fully immersed in the industry, talking about a topic I'm passionate about, and just giving back to industry. And they're going really well. They've been really well loved and attended. And yeah, I suppose it's similar to the Women in Cyber Network, but without the commercialization of it. So there's no sponsors or anything like that. And it's also slightly punchier. So because we don't have sponsors, we're allowed to be a bit more punchy with the content. So a little bit more hard hitting in terms of the topic. I'm inviting more candid speakers on. I think we've heard a lot more transparency and candid stories in this set of events. So yeah, I mean, it's been great. I love it. It's one of my highlights, definitely.
I have to say, I absolutely love your marketing for it. It's so different, certainly to any other group that, not that many groups do the same thing, but to any other women's cyber groups or anything like that. It's really cool. Not gonna lie. Every time I see any of the pictures or anything for it, like it would make me, oh, what is that? That's super cool.
Thank you.
Nail on the head with that one. I love it.
Yeah, it is. Do you know what? I love it as well. We've had so much positive feedback. So my colleague Alex in the marketing department has been really instrumental in building that with me. He shaped that with me. We did come under fire recently for had some. Well, it's just one person, but really took offence to the fact that we used lips in the Grab the Mic imagery and said that we were trying to sexualize it, and we were trying to sort of stereotype that women are sexual, and it's just like, it's about the fact that it's a talking event and it's grabbing the mic and it's having your say, and the lips aren't meant to be sexual. They're just a body part that represents what we're doing. So, I mean, you always do get, and do you know, I guess it's that old thing where if people are talking about you, it's a good thing because it means you've made an impact. But we did come under quite a bit of fire for that recently. But everyone else I've spoken to since has just said, what on earth? Like, people just, again, it's like that, having an opinion or causing a problem just for the sake of it sometimes, I think.
Exactly, yeah. Some people just want to talk for the sake of talking. And we've all seen pictures of lips that are sexual, and they definitely don't look anything like those. Definitely not. Well, I think the difference, like, if you're going to put women's lips on it and you're going to put men's lips on it, they're naturally look very, very different. Anyway. You know what? I'm sure if you put a man's mouth on it as well, people wouldn't think anything of it. It's just the shape of women's lips are typically very, very different.
No.
But hey, you're always going to get one. And like you say, at least we're talking about it.
Exactly.
You are also have received awards, and I see won the Women of Influence Award, EWF Award. How do you feel about that kind of recognition of women in the industry, and do you think there's more can be done?
Yeah, so I have quite a complex relationship with that, actually, and feelings about it. So that one was an event, a Microsoft event in Arizona. Well, it was the EWF, but Microsoft were the sponsor, I think, of those awards. Again, it was sort of really quite early in my career, and I remember feeling like really humbled by it. But how do I feel about women's awards? So part of me thinks it's great, because we're giving more opportunities, more awareness, more of a platform, more for people to talk about, celebrate. And some people just feel more comfortable, some women feel more comfortable in those women's only awards and women's only events. So I think it does serve a real purpose. The other part of me, which is probably slightly bigger, is just that I feel disappointed that we still need to segregate those awards. I'd be much happier winning a person in cybersecurity award or person of influence rather than woman of influence in that particular case.
Yeah.
And I just want to get to a place where we don't have to segregate it. that, I mean, we don't segregate the men's awards, and we don't need to, because, historically they've been very dominant in the ones that exist. So it does annoy me when they say, "Why haven't we got men in industry awards?" Well, there's so many arguments around that, but I would love to get to the place where we don't have to have the segregation, and we don't feel the need, and people don't need that comfort blanket around them. They just feel like they can go to normal awards and normal industry events and feel totally at home and totally comfortable. So, but while that isn't the case, and while people do need to be served by those networks that they can feel comfortable in, then great. Yeah. So I know that's a bit of a mixed answer, but I just have quite conflicting opinions.
It's fair. I mean, what I've seen a lot happen is people that were nominated in the women's awards to begin with we're finding them being recognized and moving into the just general industry awards. And it makes me wonder, is it that they're getting the visibility that they should be getting because they've come through that first kind of women-based one first? But then also, like what you were saying is around it, there shouldn't be a need for it. There shouldn't be a need for it anymore. We should have fixed this situation by now, and we're still we were increasing the statistics of women that are working in tech and working in cyber, and it's dropping down a little bit again post-COVID. Or it was post-COVID, it wasn't during COVID, but we're still a far cry from a 50-50 even keel with it, which is the bit that makes me sad, that then there's still a need for it to be separate because it's about awareness. It was originally about awareness anyway, though I do have a pet hate for awards where you have to pay to attend if you're, especially if you're nominated. That's a whole other different ballgame. We're not getting to that. We probably won't give it out. So with that brings me up then to my last question for you today already. And really what it is for anyone who is looking to get into journalism or cybersecurity or both, what kind of advice would you give them today?
What kind of advice would I give? Put yourself out there. Sounds really obvious, but it's hard to do that, I think, sometimes. Go to the events, meet the people, make yourself known. And I think part of that as well is it sounds a bit cliche, but building your tribe. So surrounding yourself by people that are going to push you forward, whether that be a formal mentor, a friend, potential future employer, whatever it is. The more people you meet and the more you do put yourself in those situations, I think the further you're going to go. So I think also just don't be afraid to ask for help. It's a really, really supportive industry, and it's full of people that want to share their expertise and they want to help others. So why are we not sort of taking advantage of that more, I think? So yeah, I think it's just all it's just all about putting yourself out there. It's not about who you know, but it doesn't harm to know a lot of people. Especially as a journalist, obviously your little black book needs to be as big as possible. Don't go to the same people every time. Make sure you're giving, again, it comes back to giving a platform to as many voices as possible. Let's stop repeating the same ones. Yes. Let's stop the echo chamber. And actually that sort of ties into the last question you asked me, which is, I had a bit of an argument which doesn't happen very often at all, just for the record, with a PR person who during International Women's Day or Week or something a couple of months ago put forward this amazing female expert that they work with. And they said, "Oh, I think you should interview her." And they gave all of her background, her CV, and she was really bloody inspiring. They said, "Oh, I think you should interview her because it's International Women's Day or something." And I was just like, why are you not sending me this in January, February, March, April? This is bullshit. It shouldn't just be, oh, well, let's wheel out the women in the company for this one day or week of the year. You should be giving them a platform and you should be pushing them as spokespeople, just like you do all your male ones, all year round. So, I mean, it wasn't an argument, but it was a sort of strongly worded retort where I was like, do you know what? I'm not going to do this because it's International Women's Week. Come back to me another time and pitch it as just a normal interview. And don't pitch her as she's a great woman in the industry. Just pitch her as she's a great expert that you should be talking to. And I think sometimes that kind of winds me up, the whole, well, let's just pick her to be on that panel because we need a woman.
Supports
we don't want any
tokenism.
backlash.
Yeah, which is
Crazy,
not what we're all
it?
about. Yeah.
No.
Like that. Kudos to you for sending it away. And she'll be glad of it as well, to have been like not featured just because it's International Women. As much as women are happy to not be on panels just because they're the only woman on the panel and they need to have a woman, like, they've done all that work. They've come this far and they should be recognized for what they've done, not just women.
And that's a great piece of final advice for women coming into the industry, which is don't allow yourself to be pigeonholed into that speaking on panels that are just about being a woman in security. Like, by all means, do that. If you're passionate about it and it's a topic that you want to contribute to, great, do those panels, but also sit on the panels about penetration testing or nation state attacks or whatever else it is that's your area of expertise, because you don't want to become a voice of just, well, I'm a woman, all I do is talk about being a woman. Make sure that you're also known and called upon for your general expertise. And I think that's probably something that some people, myself included, in the past have kind of got pigeonholed into, because you do one panel on one topic and then event organizers can be really lazy, right? And they'll say, oh, well, they spoke about this at this conference, I'm going to get them to speak about the same thing at my conference. And then before you know it, you're like an actor or an actress that only does rom-coms. You're Hugh Grant.
Like, it's easy to forget. Like, sometimes I put posts up on my LinkedIn and I go, sometimes I'm technical and I'll talk about technical stuff, because even sometimes I forget because there's so much stuff happening. And it happens that way, especially if you're the only woman in a particular team in the company, or you're the only woman that they have access to in that company, and suddenly you become that one. And like, say you get on one panel speaking about being a woman in tech or woman in cyber or woman in whichever, and that's what you become known for very quickly. So it's important to keep showing people that you have skills beyond that.
Good definitely
call.
But with networking groups like WeSys and others that exist out there is still such a, despite me saying it's a shame they have to exist, there's such a need for them, because it's the relationships that you build and the companionship and the support that the women in those groups give each other in terms of like job seeking and job hunting and recommendations and mentoring is just amazing. So the reality is we're not at a place where those things aren't needed. So there's still a real space for them and a need for them at the moment. Absolutely. But maybe one day there won't be.
Yeah, hopefully in my lifetime. And I'm not that
old. God.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Such wise words there, especially at the end. And I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Oh, it's been really nice. Sometimes it feels a bit weird being the one answering the questions and not asking them.
Not scary on my side at all. Like, no.
Thank you for having me.